Hi, I'm Sylvie Simonds. I'm an art historian who specializes in the 60s, and I'll be speaking today about the Farmer exhibition, Let's Make the Water Turn Black. It's perhaps interesting to start with the title and the significance of the title in relation to Frank Zappa, who was a 60s rock musician, the leader in Mothers of Invention. Zappa was, obviously, he was, a very active musician in the 60s, and he did have long hair, and he kind of didn't, on the one hand, you would say, oh, he, kind of fits right in with the zeitgeist, but he was quite, straight edge. He didn't do any drugs. He wasn't part of a commune, and he was definitely outspoken about being anti-hippie. Perhaps reservation to be part of the group is quite interesting, because on the one hand we can start to kind of unpack, well, what is the reluctance to not label yourself as being part of the hippies or the counterculture. Farmer's installation has references to the music of Zappa in the past, but also to musique concrète, avant-garde composers, ethnographic music clips from the early 20th century, and even going back to the 1890s, the first sound recording. And these kinds of musical references were also important for avant-garde musicians in the 60s, and even Zappa would have been aware of some of this kind of experimental music that was happening at that period. Which kind of leads me to talk about the strange relationship between music in the 60s and technology, and even artists as well. And there was a strange kind of overlap between the more experimental sides with people like Steve Reich, Terry Riley, and then you also have kind of more countercultural musicians like Grateful Dead, or even maybe Zappa's kind of in there too. And where the question of technology fits in is quite interesting. Rock music was really a huge part of the 60s, but there was also kind of countercultural artists who were using kind of the theatrical medium, if you will, of light shows and kind of sensory overload and those kind of mechanisms to create an atmosphere that would expand consciousness. And for example, you have USCO, which was led by Gerd Stern, who is who was a scientist in his own right, who was doing kind of huge multimedia presentations that were not kind of isolated events. You had all sorts of kind of, you have theater that was kind of using multimedia, kinetic theater, you have living theater, then you also have Lamont Young's Eternal Theater of Music, things like that. So it doesn't exist alone. But what's quite interesting is that you get kind of CIA, government officials, and market research people in corporations who are quite interested in some of the methods of more mainstream countercultural events or happenings, like something like ESCO would be of interest. And this is for two reasons. One, the use of sensory overload and stimulation would perhaps provide models and evidence to kind of promote or enhance the rock concerts. So this would take interest in certain market research and for corporations. And on the other side, you have more kind of governmental officials and CIA investigation be interested in some of the countercultural mechanisms because of at the same time, they were focused on sensory deprivation, which were methods that were used for kind of isolation and torture to extract and understand information about how to kind of subvert communism, the threat of communism. And sensory overload and stimulation, if done correctly, had almost the same effects as sensory deprivation. So there was interest on both the right and the left to kind of subvert and expand consciousness, and that was co-opted and used for both in both kind of radical and also perhaps really reactionary ways. And how this points back to Farmer's installation is, again, it's really drawing on some of the kind of hang-ups from the 60s, the kind of the things that were not resolved. So perhaps the question concerning technology and how that relates to sound installation, how that relates to music, especially we're in a digital age now. And Zappa in his later years used the synclaver, which was just a purely technological means to create music. So there was no longer this kind of embodied presence, and the use of musicians is no longer perhaps relevant today. But also even more drawing back from the kind of haunting past of the 60s is you have this sensory overload and stimulation, which is very much displayed in the installation. Not to the extent as it was in the 60s perhaps, but it's still there and the threads are still there. So to conclude, it kind of draws on, I would encourage people to think about classifications and how Zappa really challenges our understanding of the 60s and the hippies. And not everyone was working together for the same opposition. And sometimes, even in your resistance to be part of the group, the larger forces were already kind of working against some of those ideals and models. So I think today we can have perhaps a better understanding of that period, and the exhibition kind of challenges to think of the past and the present in really interesting ways.